Hi, Andreas from Toddle here, and today we're going to learn about components. Now, up until now, if you've been following this course, you should be quite familiar with pages. And pages and components are almost the same thing, except components can be embedded inside pages and even inside other components. This makes them really powerful for things like sharing, styling, or logic, and you can also use them to break down your application into small and more manageable chunks. You can sort of think of components as Lego bricks that you snap together to build your whole application. We're going to look at two examples today. First, we're going to build a small counter where we can increment and decrement, for example, the number of items in a shopping basket. And second, we're going to build a tooltip component that makes it really easy to add a tooltip to some of the elements on our page. So here I've loaded up my application and I'm on the shopping basket page. And what I have here is a simple basket with 3 items in it and the price of each. And then in the bottom, I've got the total price of all the items in the basket. And what I want to create now is a component where you can add or subtract the count of each of these sort of items, right? So maybe we'll start out with 1 of each, and then you can click a plus button to add more, and you click minus to subtract, right? And what we want is obviously the price on the right for each item to increase or decrease depending on the count. And we also want the total price to change, right? So let's go and create a new counter component. So I'm going to go in here to my project sidebar, and I'm going to go into the components tab and then click the plus button. So when you create a new component in Toddle, you have to provide it with a prefix and a name. So I'm going to call this basket counter. And if you're familiar with web components, this is the same naming structure they use. And this sort of allows us to very clearly distinguish what is a component and what is just a normal HTML element in your page. So I'm going to go ahead and click create. And now I'm at my basket counter component, right? And right off the bat, we don't have anything in it. So we're going to add a button. I think we're going to change its width to 8. Normally I wouldn't set, and then change the inside here to plus. Now, normally I wouldn't set a fixed width on a button like this because we kind of wanted to adjust to the text inside. In this case, I know it's just going to be a plus or minus, so it's not going to be a problem. I'm also just quickly going to change the font size to small. And then just by holding down Alt and dragging, I can duplicate this button, change this one to a minus. And then I want to add a paragraph inside, which right now we're just going to set to 1. We're going to put that inside in between these two, right? Change the layout. I think we want them horizontally and aligned, and then give them a little bit of gap in between. Right. So now we've got the visuals of a basket counter done, right? And now we need to add the logic. And the thing is, for this counter, we could sort of start by saying, well, we might go and say, let's create a variable, kind of like we did in the interactive applications video, where we added a variable for showing and hiding a modal, right? So we could have add a variable here, count, started at 1, and then every time bind it to this paragraph, every time we click a button, we sort of increment that variable by 1 and count it down by 1, right? And that would make a perfectly valid counter. But the thing is, we need access to this count data that actually has to live in the page, in the basket. So when you have multiple components or pages and components that need access to the same data, you need to move that data into the sort of topmost components. So in this case, this data have to live in the parent of this one, and the parent of this one is going to be the shopping basket, right? And it needs to live in the parent, and then it needs to share that data with this component. And then what this component is going to do is it's going to notify the parent when a change happens, and then the parent's going to take care of that. So that might not inherently make a lot of sense right away, but I'll show you how it works, and then probably it'll be a lot more clear, right? So let's first delete this variable. So what we're going to do instead is that we're going to add an attribute. And if you've been looking at this tab while it's been open, you've probably noticed that it's a little bit different than the data tab for a page. because on a page we have a URL at the top, and that's now gone, and instead we have attributes. We also have this events tab out here, or this event section down here, which we also don't have in a page, and we'll be using both of them today, right? So first we're going to add an attribute, and we're going to call this one count, and the test value we're going to give it is there we go. The test value we're going to give it is 0. Right, actually, let's get that back up again. There we go, I think. So attributes in many ways are a bit like variables, but the difference is that attributes are provided by the parent. So in this case, our basket, when we add this component into the basket, we'll have to specify what this count data should be. But when it does that, now inside this component, we can use that anywhere inside a formula, right? We also here, when we create one, add a test value. That doesn't impact at all how your application runs. It won't be part of the final application. It's just for while we're developing here in Toddle, we need sort of a value as a placeholder, right? So since we're not currently developing and it's not inside another component, there's no other component that can sort of provide it with these attributes. So we give it a test one instead. Right. And then this count, we're going to set that to 0, yes, by test value. And now we're going to go and bind that to the text inside a paragraph. So we're going to select the text, select the formula icon here, and then we're going to select attributes here in our formula editor, right? So now we can see the count change to 0, right? So the next step for us is to then actually let the parent be notified when we change this, when we click one of the buttons. But before we go there, I think we should just add this counter into our basket component, and then you can see how we provide this attribute to the component, right? So we're going to go back to our project sidebar. We're going to load up our basket page. And then here inside this list item that we are looping over, we're going to add a new element, and we're going to call it our basket counter. And we are just going to move that up here, I think. And then we're just going to change this layout. Right, that looks okay. I can live with that. We'll give it a bit of depth. Okay, so now this says undefined because we haven't provided with anything. So we're going to select the basket counter. Now you can see here under attributes that we have count listed because we defined that as an attribute for our basket counter. And we can give that any sort of value. We could type 1. But this is a static value. And what we want to do is actually give it the count from this item, right? And if you remember our application for building dynamic websites, what we're doing here is we're repeating over some data, just like we did in that video, right? So, and because we're doing that, inside our basket counter, we have access to a repeat item. And this repeat item is part of this basket that we have on this page, and it has a count property on it. So we're going to pick that one. So we're going to give the attribute count in our component. That's going to get the count from our repeat item, right? So for each list, it'll technically get a different one. Now, of course, in this case, they're all 1. So that's because the initial count of each is 1. So that hasn't changed, right? Good. So now you understand how we sort of can define an attribute for a component, and we can have the parent of that component provide that attribute to it, right? Now the next step we're going to do is we're going to and also you can think of this as a way for the parent to provide information or send data to a component. You can think of it sort of as a tree where from up at top of the tree, we sort of send data down to the branches lower down, right? So one page here can have multiple components inside it. It can send data down to them, and they can even have multiple subcomponents, and they can send data down to them. So we can sort of send data down the tree by using attributes. If we want any information to go back up the tree, that happens with events. And of course, when we're changing the value, when we're counting, incrementing, and decrementing, that's exactly what we want to do. So we're going to go to the basket component, counter component again. And I can actually do that just by double clicking it here in the left panel, right? So what we want to do now is we want to specify an event that we can trigger that lets us notify the parent that the count should change. So we're going to go to data, and then here we have events. We're going to create a new one, and we're just going to call it change, because we're only going to have one event here, so there's no reason to give it a long, complicated name. It's just change, right? And again, just like with attributes, we need to give it a test value. And again, this is only for while we're developing. But in this case, it's not for inside this component. It's actually so the parent component has some data, some idea of what kind of data is going to come along with that change. So we're going to say the test value is 1. Obviously, the actual value will differ depending on what button you click and how many times you click it. But the test value here, we're just providing 1, right? We're going to say done. And then the last thing I want to do is I want to take the plus button and I want to add a new event to that. And if you remember our interactive applications, you're already quite familiar with how we do that. We're going to click on the events tab here. And then I'm going to choose click. And here in my workflow editor, I want to call an action. And because we created an event, this trigger change event action is now available. We're going to choose that one. Now, the data we want to send up when we click the plus is essentially a number that's 1 more than the one we got in as an attribute, right? So right now, if the value here is 0, we want to send 1. If it's 1, we want to send 2, and so on, right? So the way we're going to do that is we're going to start inside our formula here by choosing the count attribute. And then we're going to add another node to our formula here. And we're going to say add 1. 1 is the default value when you add, because it's kind of the most common thing that you do, right? So in this case, we take the value of the attribute count, we add 1 to it, and that's our formula here, right? And that data is what we pass to this change event that we're going to send up to our parent component. In this case, parent component is a page, right? So a parent page, right? Right. Now we just need to do more or less the same thing with the minus button. We're going to add the click event. We're going to trigger change. And this, we're still going to start with count, but this time we're going to say minus. Because right here, we're taking 1 away from it, right? So there's always 1 less. Now, ideally, our application should probably handle situations where something is -1. We're going to completely ignore it for this example. But of course, in this shopping basket, in that case, you might want to either delete the items from the list entirely, or maybe you want to not have it count below 0, right? We're going to completely ignore that problem for now. So now our component is done, and we can go back to our shopping basket. There we are. So now here on the component, we already have our attribute added correctly. Now we need to define what happens on our change event. And this is going to be exactly, or not exactly, but it's going to be somewhat similar to what you've seen before, right? We defined, we chose the event. Now we need to add what kind of action happens here. And what we actually want to do, because for this example, our whole basket is stored in a variable. In a real example, that's probably on a server somewhere in a database, and you might need to go and you'll probably have to send that a request and say, can you please update the count of my basket? But for this example, we're just storing it in the browser in a variable, right? So I'm going to update that variable. And that value, so by default, this sort of suggests that maybe we're going to update it with that event, because we don't know what it is you want to do yet, right? And you can see here the value 1 is what we provided to the test value inside the event in the basket counter, right? But what I actually want to do here is I want to take my basket, and then I only want to update the count of the item that we're currently repeating over, right? So we had these 3 items in basket, and right now, if I'm clicking on if I'm changing something in the count on the first one, I want the item count in the first item to go up 1, or change to whatever it's changing. If down 1, if it's down, up, if it's up, right? If it's in the second one, obviously I want to change it for the second one, and in the third one for the third one, right? So the way we're going to do this, because we're repeating, and these are not like strict static 3, we're actually just listing over the ones in the basket. And you could imagine that we have options of adding more things to the basket. So maybe there could be 5 or 10 items and not just always 3, right? So we want to make sure that when we click this particular counter, the first one, we want the first one to count up. And the way we're doing that is relying again on our repeat item data to let us know which one are we actually incrementing, right? Because we only need to set this one. Because we're repeating, we just set this once, and then it's going to apply to all 3 of them, right? So let's go back to the change. We're going to set basket. We're going to update the whole value of the basket, right? And here we're going to use one called set. One of the nice things about set here is you can provide this with an array as a second key, and that will actually let you set values that are sort of deeply nested inside the original item. And I'll show you what I mean. So what we want to do here is, let's say we're clicking on the top item, and we want to set the count for that to the new value, right? So we're going to, you can see here we have the 0th item here, and then it's the count here that we actually want to set. So the value we want to set is sort of the basket, and then 0, and then count. And we can do that with set by giving it an array as its value here. So I'll show you what we will add an array. And then the first item in this array should be the index. We want to set the item inside here. And we could we'll just add 0 for now. We'll change that to actually, let's just do that now. Let's just change that to the index. That's easier. So that'll depend on what item you are in the list. It'll change that item, right? And the second thing we want to add here is count. So what this does is it says, take the basket, but then set the 0th item's count, in this case, just to the string item. And if we look over here, what happens is that count now is just the word item for the object. But we still have a basket. It still looks and has the same shape. It's still an array, has the same shape as the original one. But inside it, we've changed just this one thing. So this array here, this path is sort of targeting what exactly is that I want to set inside this data, right? And of course, we don't want to set it to item. We actually want to set it to this event. Right, so the event is whatever's coming back from our counter component saying, update the values of this. And what we're doing here is saying, great, I'm going to update the value. And I'm going to do that by targeting exactly the value inside this basket I need to set. And then I'm going to return this new outcomes, this new basket with exactly the right data, right? And this value in the formula is what we're then passing into this action set basket. So whenever we do that, we're going to update the basket with the new information, right? So now we're all set. Let's try it out. We're going to open test mode, and then we'll try adding another grape. And we can see as we do that, the number here, the price, individual price counted up because I already defined that earlier as a formula. And the total price as well counted up because, again, that was set before we started, right? And we can see we can add a ton of bananas, and we can see the count going up, the price going up, and everything, right? So that was a very simple example of creating a counter component to let us increment and decrement items in a shopping basket. So now that we've added the counter component, I want to add a small tooltip to these labels here, grapes, bananas, apples. And when you hover it, I want to show the unit price of each, right? Because as we here go and add some different numbers, obviously we just see the total summing up at the end here. And I think it would be really nice to be able to hover and see what's actually the unit price of an item here, right? So I'm going to start out by creating a new component. I'm going to go to my project overview again, and I'm going to click Add Component, and we're going to call this Element Tooltip. The thing that can be a bit tricky about tooltips here is that we don't really know when we're building this component what we're going to be using it for, right? It's going to be a tooltip, but what is the tooltip going to be and what is the content going to be? So we have to sort of allow the parent again on the basket page, we have to specify what is the element we want to have the tooltip on. And we also need the parent to specify what's actually going to be in the tooltip. So we can do that here in components. Of course, we could use an attribute, just like we did with count. You could say, provide the text to an attribute and then display it in here. And that would work just fine. But then our tooltip would only be able to show text, and we wouldn't be able to do any sort of formatting or styling on that text. And that can actually be quite nice. So we're going to do something slightly different here. We're going to select our root element, and then we're going to add a slot. And a slot inside a component denotes a place where you can put children. So normally when we're building, if we put in like a div or a button or something, we can add children to that element and they will show up inside the element. And components actually work exactly the same place. But when you put a element inside, when you nest elements inside a component, the component gets to decide where do they actually show up in their tree. And that's what slots are for here. So we're going to add one slot here, and we're going to add an element inside this. So the button here won't actually show up in the final output when we use this component, because we will override it by putting something inside the slot from the parent element. But while we're developing the component, it's really nice to have something here that we can see and that we can sort of interact with, right? So now we've added a place for the element to be. Now we need to add the actual tooltip. So I'm going to select the root element, and I'm going to add a div. And inside the div, we're going to put in another slot. So this sort of allows us to put two elements inside. One is going to be the element we want to hover, and the second one is going to be the content of the tooltip. So if we want a simple paragraph text, we can do that. If we want an image, we can add that. So it sort of gives us the freedom to use the tooltip to whatever kind of content we want, right? And this slot needs a name. So by default, the slot's name is default. But we can give it a different name. In this case, we're going to call it tooltip. And that means when we're adding children to this element later, we can sort of decide what slot should they be placed into. And this is really powerful for creating components that are very configurable and very, very reusable, right? We're going to add another placeholder inside this, and it's going to be a paragraph for now, right? And this is a paragraph as text. It's perfectly fine. Again, this is not what's going to show up in the final result. This is just while we're developing the tooltip. So I'm going to first select the div here, and then I'm going to change its background to something like, yeah, that's pretty good. We're going to add some padding. Yeah, two is fine. Let's maybe make the text just a little bit. Oh, that was background again. There we go. And we want the text. That's better. Right, and then the width of this, we actually want to set that to... No, I think we're okay with this for now. But what we are going to do is we're going to change its position. So right now, this tooltip is taking up space in our flow, right? And you can see if I add another one below, you can see it sort of pushes that button down. And tooltips are supposed to sit on top of the UI, not actually change the flow or any direction of any or position of any of the other elements, right? Let's just remove this again. So we're going to change this position to absolute. And then we're going to set top to 100%. And what that means is it's going to say, well, I'm going to push myself down to be 100% off the top. So right below the element. But if you see now, if we add a button element below, yeah, actually it now pushes below. That makes sense because it's actually below the element, right? So it's pushing itself down, but it's not interfering with the flow of the page in any way, right? Because it's position absolute. we are going to give it, I'm just going to move myself into the middle. We're going to change the corners to 2, I think. And then we're just going to use margin top of like this. Yeah, 1 is fine. And so by combining top, which we used here in position of 100%, and margin top of 1, we can sort of say it's 100% plus 1. So it allows us to combine units here in offsetting this tooltip, right? Let me just move myself back. Okay, so far so good. We've created a tooltip. It's styled the way we want, but of course, it's right now it's always showing, right? And we want it to only show when we're hovering the button, right? So to do this, we're going to introduce a variable that can keep track of whether the tooltip should be shown or not. And the idea is we'll then set that to true when we want to show the tooltip. We'll set it to false when we want to hide it, right? So let's go and add a new variable. We're going to call it show, and we're going to set its value to true. No, we're going to set it to false to start with. That should be the default, to not show it, right? And then we're going to select our tooltip div, and in attributes, we're going to choose show. And again, we're saying here show, right? So only show this element if the variable show is true. And now it's gone. And the last bit we need to do here is then we need to pick up this element. So we actually want to do when you hover the button, right? But the button here is just a placeholder. So we want to put this event listener on the actual root here, because then if you hover inside this element, it's also going to be true, right? So we're going to select the element tooltip. We're going to click events. And then here we're going to on mouse, we're going to pick the one called mouse enter. And when we mouse enter, we want to set our variable show to true. And then we want to add mouse leave. Did we get mouse? We want to add mouse leave, and we want to set our variable show to false. There's also a mouse over. I'll just move myself into the middle again. Mouse over here, and what mouse over does is it'll trigger every time you move the mouse over the button. So not just when you enter it, but also when you're moving the mouse inside it. It'll keep triggering, I think, about 60 times a second, right? And sometimes that's exactly what you want if you're like having something follow your mouse or something. But for this case, it's kind of like when the mouse goes in, we want to show it once and then off. So we don't need to trigger that event constantly while we're moving over it, right? That's why we're using mouse enter. So let's move back there. Okay, so that should kind of do it. Let's go into test mode and see. When I'm mousing over, I get my tooltip, and when I'm mousing out, it's done. It's gone. Perfect. So now our element tooltip component is done. Let's go and try it out in our basket. So I'm gonna, in this case, press Command K to open my side panel, and then pick basket, right? And right here on this is the span I want to put a tooltip on. And so the way I'm doing that is actually I'm putting in the element tooltip, and then I'm putting the span inside it. So I'm going to go up to the parent element here and then add my element tooltip. And then I'm going to drop my span inside that. Now, if we try that now, test, you will actually see that we do get the original "this is a paragraph" tooltip, because we haven't replaced it with anything. Then it just used the default placeholder, right? And also we can see that we have some clipping issues here. So let's just go back to our tooltip and make sure this div has a nice set index of 10. So set index is like how far out from the screen technically should it be in the set dimension, which is the one pointing at you. So the higher the set index, the closer to you it'll be, and the more on top of other things it'll be. Let's try that again with basket and see if that worked. And now we've got the tooltip on top of the element, right? Now let's add the actual tooltip we want to show, because obviously we don't want this. This is a tooltip span. So we select the element tooltip. We add an element, which is a paragraph. And inside this paragraph, I want to write the unit price and then per unit or per item, I think, right? So first I'm going to add a span because I want to actually style unit price a little bit different. So I'm going to add a span here, and I'm going to say dollars. I'm going to add another text element. So the reason why I'm adding two text elements in here is that I want one just to say dollar, and I want this one to be defined as a formula. And instead of going along and concatenating strings and doing anything sort of complex formula operation, I can just put two text elements in, and they'll sort it out, right? They'll show next to each other as they should. But so for the second one, I'm going to define a formula. And here I want to again use my repeat item, as we've done a few times. And I'm just going to pick out the price, right? Because that's the unit price. The total price on the right is calculated with the formula. So if you're looking at this, you notice that this sort of screwed up our layout a little bit. And that's because this paragraph right now is not set to be in the tooltip slot. It's set to be in the default slot, and therefore it'll be part of the thing that we hover, right? So we want to change that to be in the tooltip slot. And we do that by going to attributes. And then down here, because we're inside an element, now we have this slot section, and I can change that to tooltip. Right. And then here we're just going to add per item. So let's try that. Okay. We're getting some $1 per item. This looks pretty good. I think the sizing of this is a bit off. So what I'm going to do is take this paragraph and says you should be with max content. So max content means take up as much space as the content would want you to. And I'll show you what that means here, that when we put up max content, now it'll be as big as the text inside it wants to be without breaking, but it won't be any bigger, right? There's also minimum content, which is the smallest amount that's allowed. So in this case, that would be let the text break. But for example, if you had an image of a certain size, it wouldn't go smaller than that image, right? And then there's a fit content, which is sort of trying to do the best fit. Right, that's pretty good. Let's add a little bit of styling to this span. So I'm going to take the text color and bump it up here. And I'm going to make the font bold, I think. Let's see how that looks. That looks pretty good. Maybe that was a bit aggressive on the text color. Let's just bump that down to, how's that? Yeah. So that is how we can add a tooltip and a counter component to our basket. And you can see how, because we use slots for the tooltip, we can put more complex elements inside this. We could have put images and everything inside. You generally don't want to put anything interactive inside a tooltip because they're not supposed to be an interactive element. The element you're hovering is, but not the tooltip, because the second you try and click inside, it goes away, right? But you can put images, text, all sorts of things inside. You could even, I suppose, put an auto-playing video. Probably not a great use case, but pretty much whatever you want, right? And by building the component like this and using slots, we really let you decide when you use it rather than when you define the element, right? So that was a short introduction to how components work in Toddle. We saw how you can use attributes and events to communicate with your parent component, to send attributes down and trigger events to send information up. We've shown how you can use slots to configure the actual elements inside the component. So when you use it in different contexts and different places, the components can actually show up a bit different depending on what you need. And this is sort of these are ways you can make components that are very configurable and very, very reusable, right? We also showed that components can have their own variables that interact independently of any parent. Here for the tooltip, allowing you to toggle the tooltip on and off without any sort of state needs or any data needs to live in the parent. Components can also have their own APIs that they can trigger when they get put on the page and when they get shown. And also pretty much everything you can do with a page, again, you can also do with a component, right? So they're just a really good way to break your application down in more manageable pieces, and makes it really a lot easier to work with Toddle. Next, we're going to be looking at how we can build authenticated apps in Toddle. So how we can use APIs that require authentication, and how we can communicate with the backend to also store some data and receive it as well. So I hope, if you're not subscribed, please do that now. The video will come out soon. If you're subscribed, it'll let you know. Thank you very much for watching.